What if the past is not incomplete because it was lost, but because it was removed, not erased violently, not burned in a single moment of destruction, but softened, folded, simplified, until what remained felt complete enough to stop asking questions? There is a particular discomfort that appears when you look too closely at the long arc of human history. It is not fear. It is closer to the sensation of entering a familiar room and sensing, without evidence, that something large once stood there. The furniture is arranged, the walls are clean, the space makes sense, and yet the absence is heavy. Civilizations rise, collapse, and vanish in the official record with an efficiency that feels almost rehearsed. Entire ages dissolve into paragraphs, thousands of years compress into footnotes. And then abruptly history resumes, organized, confident, linear, as if nothing unusual has happened at all. This video is not here to convince you that ancient super-civilizations ruled the world. It is not here to sell mystery for its own sake. It is here to sit quietly with an unease that refuses to go away. An unease that emerges not from what we know, but from the extraordinary silence surrounding what we do not. Modern history teaches a comforting progression. Stone tools become bronze, villages become cities, myth becomes science. The story is clean, efficient, reassuring. It tells us that humanity could only have arrived here by following this exact path. But beneath that structure lies a tension scholars rarely voice aloud. The archaeological record does not always behave the way the story requires it to. It hesitates, it repeats itself, it skips. There are moments when human capability appears fully formed without a visible apprenticeship. Monumental architecture emerges where survival should have consumed all energy. Astronomical alignments appear long before accepted models of mathematical knowledge. Symbolic systems arrive already complex, already layered, already burdened with meaning. And then, just as mysteriously, these capabilities disappear again. The official explanation often relies on absence of evidence, absence of preservation, absence of necessity. Yet absence itself becomes suspicious when it forms patterns, when the same kinds of gaps recur across continents, when cultures separated by oceans and millennia describe similar destructions, similar restarts, similar warnings, when the record feels not random but compressed, like a long manuscript forced into a much smaller binding. Pages are missing, but the binding remains intact, convincing most readers that nothing is wrong. Geological processes erase slowly. Floods leave sediment, ice leaves scars. Time advances and retreats with signatures that can still be measured. But cultural erasure is quieter. It happens when narratives are simplified, when inconvenient complexity is softened, when timelines are standardized for education, governance, and belief, when ambiguity is treated as a threat rather than an invitation. Throughout history, there have always been observers who noticed this discomfort, not mystics, not outsiders, but trained scholars. Geologists unsettled by sudden breaks in gradual change. Archaeologists puzzled by craftsmanship that appears too refined too early. Linguists confused by symbolic leaps that arrive without transition. Their questions were rarely answered directly. More often they were absorbed, reframed, or quietly sidelined, not necessarily by malice, but by systems that favor stability over uncertainty. The idea that human civilization may have risen and fallen multiple times is not new. It has surfaced, disappeared, and resurfaced for more than a century. Each time it encounters the same resistance, not because it is proven false, but because it destabilizes something deeper than dates. It destabilizes identity. It suggests that progress is not guaranteed, that knowledge can be lost, that forgetting may be as fundamental to humanity as invention. If civilizations existed before ours, whether 7 or many more, the number matters less than the implication. It would mean collapse is not an exception, it is a rhythm, that humanity does not stand at the end of a line but somewhere in the middle of a cycle whose beginning and end are both obscured. And perhaps that is why the record feels so carefully managed, not to deceive but to protect, to preserve the belief that this time is different, that this ascent will be permanent. That forgetting is something that happened to others long ago under different skies, yet the silence between ages remains heavy. Patient, unexplained, history does not usually scream when it is incomplete. It whispers, and it waits. The more carefully one looks at the human timeline, the more it begins to resemble a shoreline after a storm, smooth in places, violently interrupted in others, with long stretches where the sand reveals nothing at all. Deep time stretches beyond intuition. Millions of years marked by continental drift, magnetic reversals, mass extinctions. Against this immensity, recorded human history is barely a surface scratch. A few thousand years of writing, a few centuries of industrial memory, and then suddenly obscurity. According to the accepted model, modern humans spent tens of thousands of years as scattered hunter-gatherers, living lightly on the land, leaving behind little more than tools and bones. Civilization, we are told, was a late and fragile invention, an accident of agriculture, itself enabled by climate stability. Yet this explanation rests on a delicate assumption that complexity requires time but leaves almost no trace while it develops. When complexity finally appears, it does so without hesitation. Large-scale construction, burial practices infused with cosmology, mathematical awareness of celestial cycles. These are not the artifacts of a slow, uncertain beginning. They look practiced, rehearsed, as though humanity had done this before. The unease deepens when one notices repetition. Across continents, early civilizations emerge carrying similar preoccupations. Alignment with the sky, reverence for ancestors, fear of floods, stories of destruction followed by renewal. These patterns are often dismissed as universal psychology, but universality can also be inheritance, shared memory compressed into story. Geology does not forget easily. Ice cores preserve ancient atmospheres. Sediment layers record abrupt floods and sudden temperature shifts. And these records reveal moments of violent disruption. Ecosystems collapsed, large species vanished, human populations were forced into retreat or migration. What remains unclear is what happened to knowledge during these moments. Tools can be remade, populations can recover, but complex systems, language, engineering traditions, symbolic codes are fragile. They require continuity. Interrupt that continuity, and even advanced cultures can dissolve within generations. This is where the official narrative grows cautious. It acknowledges catastrophe but minimizes consequence. Civilizations may have fallen, it insists, but knowledge always survived somewhere, always passed on, always rebuilt upward. Yet history itself offers countless counterexamples. Libraries burned, languages lost, techniques forgotten so completely that later cultures could only marvel at their results. The silence between prehistoric cultures may not represent emptiness. It may represent erasure, not intentional, but thorough. A convergence of disaster, population collapse, and the slow decay of memory. When survivors rebuild, they do not start from zero, but neither do they inherit everything. What remains is partial, distorted, mythologized. This could explain a recurring strangeness in ancient texts. References to ancestors who lived impossibly long lives, to teachers who arrived already knowing the arts of civilization. To golden ages that ended not in moral failure, but in fire, water, or darkness. These are not the fantasies of naive societies. They are echoes of loss filtered through generations who no longer fully understood what had been taken from them. Modern chronology smooths these echoes into allegory. Myth becomes imagination. Symbol becomes exaggeration. Yet compression is precisely how fragile information survives long gaps. When writing disappears, story remains. When measurement fails, symbol persists. When explanation is lost, ritual continues. The idea that humanity has restarted more than once becomes less radical when viewed through this lens. It does not require global empires or advanced technology. It requires only repeated breaks in continuity and reconstruction from fragments. Each restart would feel unprecedented to those living through it. Each would believe itself the first. And so the discomfort does not come from the possibility of forgotten civilizations. It comes from what their forgetting implies. That history is not a ladder but a tide. That advancement is temporary. That knowledge is mortal. The timeline, once seen this way, no longer feels incomplete by accident. It feels edited by reality itself, by forces that erase not maliciously but efficiently. What survives is not what mattered most. It is what endured longest. And so the question quietly forms, unresolved and persistent. If humanity has crossed this threshold before, how would we recognize the signs that memory is slipping again? Before the silence returns to smooth the shoreline once more, this is where our journey begins. Once the possibility of repetition is allowed to breathe, the past begins to rearrange itself. The familiar sequence, primitive, advanced, modern, loses its authority. In its place emerges a more troubling shape, one defined not by ascent but by interruption. What once appeared as a straight line begins to resemble a series of broken arcs, each rising, bending, and collapsing into silence. Long before these ideas drifted into speculation, they lived quietly within serious academic debate. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, geologists began to notice something unsettling. The Earth did not behave as gently as theory demanded. Layers of sudden destruction appeared where slow change was expected. Climate shifts occurred too rapidly to be explained by gradualism alone. Extinction events left scars too abrupt to ignore. From this discomfort emerged catastrophism, not as myth but as method. The recognition that the planet does not always change politely, that sometimes it resets violently. Within this framework, human civilization became a problem. Earth itself experiences repeated shocks. Why would human societies be exempt from their consequences? And if they were not exempt, why did history insist on a single uninterrupted march forward? The resistance to these questions was subtle. There were no dramatic denouncements. Instead, catastrophes were acknowledged but isolated. Human resilience was emphasized. Any suggestion that advanced societies might have existed earlier was reframed as misunderstanding, exaggeration, or coincidence. Not because it was conclusively disproven, but because it complicated an already fragile narrative of origins. The idea that intelligence does not guarantee survival is deeply unsettling. It suggests that complexity is not permanent, that cultures can vanish so thoroughly their absence feels natural. The archaeological record continued to behave inconveniently. In multiple locations, evidence appeared that refused to fit neatly into established timelines. Precision stonework without clear developmental stages, urban planning that implied inherited knowledge, artifacts whose sophistication seemed out of proportion with the cultures officially assigned to them. Each discovery was addressed individually, never collectively. Individually, anomalies are tolerable. Collectively, they form patterns, and patterns suggest memory, not conscious memory, but cultural residue, fragments of techniques once widespread, now scattered. A civilization rebuilding after collapse does not announce itself as a successor. It believes itself original. It interprets remnants as divine gifts, ancestral wisdom, revelations from beyond. This process is visible in how ancient societies describe their beginnings. Rarely do they describe slow experimentation. Instead, they speak of teachers, lawgivers, civilizers who arrived already knowing what to build and how to live. These accounts are usually dismissed as mythological inflation. But inflation implies a core, something smaller expanded through retelling, not invented whole. Modern dismissal relies heavily on chronology. Dates are assigned, sequences enforced. Anything that disrupts order is labeled symbolic, but chronology is a tool, not a law. It depends on continuity. Break continuity and the tool falters. The deeper issue is not whether multiple civilizations existed. It is why the idea provokes such discomfort. It threatens the belief that the present represents an unprecedented peak. That history culminates here. If earlier societies reached similar heights, modernity becomes conditional rather than miraculous, less destiny, more circumstance. In this light, erasure does not require conspiracy. It requires preference. Educational systems favor clarity. Institutions favor coherence. Narratives implying vulnerability are destabilizing, so complexity is softened, ambiguity trimmed. Possibility narrowed until only the most manageable version of the past remains. And yet something continues to resist this narrowing. A low hum of unresolved questions. Why do early cultures obsess over the sky? Why does myth encode catastrophe more often than triumph? Why do the oldest stories mourn endings rather than celebrate beginnings? Perhaps the most unsettling thought is not that civilizations were erased, but that their erasure was ordinary. That it occurred through flood, fire, climate shift, migration, and forgetting. that survivors rebuilt without realizing how much had vanished. If this is true, then the number of civilizations matters less than the pattern. Humanity does not stand outside collapse, it moves through it. The discomfort deepens when one turns to the subject of water. Again and again, memory turns to flood. Across cultures separated by oceans and eras, destruction arrives not as fire, but as rising tide. Floods erase borders, flatten hierarchies, leave survivors unsure of what deserves to endure. What troubles careful readers of ancient accounts is not the presence of flood stories, but their precision. They are not vague metaphors. They describe warning signs, animals behaving strangely, elders dismissed, preparations made too late. They speak of boats built under ridicule, of mountains emerging from receding waters, of a world rendered unfamiliar overnight. Such consistency is often explained away as shared psychology. But this explanation falters when the stories insist not on rebirth but on loss. What follows the flood is rarely triumph, it is grief, a sense that something irreplaceable has slipped beyond recall. In some accounts the flood is punishment, in others accident, in a few inevitability. What they share is implication. Destruction was not total, someone survived, something was remembered. From a geological perspective, this is not implausible. Earth's history includes rapid sea level rise, glacial melt pulses, and catastrophic flooding triggered by collapsing ice dams. Such events would devastate coastal and river-based societies, the very places where early civilizations concentrated. A single generation could witness the erasure of landscapes believed permanent. What follows such trauma is not continuity, but improvisation. Survivors rebuild with urgency, not reflection. They preserve what they can, not what they value most. Over time, practical memory outlasts theoretical understanding. Techniques remain, explanations fade. Ritual persists where reasoning is lost. Story becomes the vessel for truth too heavy to carry any other way. This may explain why flood myths function less as mythology and more as compressed history. Records stripped of dates but not of consequence. Modern archaeology acknowledges floods but struggles with scale. Local disasters are acceptable, global ones are not, yet global does not mean simultaneous. A series of regional catastrophes within a short geological window could feel universal to those experiencing them, especially if communication already existed. What is remembered as one flood may have been many, overlapping in memory and meaning. The discomfort grows when one notices how often these stories emphasize preservation. Seeds, tools, animals, laws, measurements. Not survival for its own sake, but continuity. This insistence suggests prior loss, an awareness that forgetting is more dangerous than death. Floods erase without leaving obvious scars. Stone survives, wood rots, metal corrodes, absence becomes evidence of absence. The illusion of primitivity is reinforced. What appears simple may simply be what endured. This selective survival shapes the historical record. Chronology becomes reconstruction based on debris rather than design. And repetition begins to feel less like coincidence. As waters recede in memory, the land that emerges is never the same. Those who step onto it carry quiet knowledge. What was lost will never be fully recovered, and what comes next will believe itself new. When water withdraws, what remains is stone, not because stone was most important, but because stone is patient. Across the world, structures resist the timelines assigned to them. Massive blocks fitted with precision. Foundations far older than the cultures built upon them. Walls whose scale implies confidence, not experimentation. The discomfort does not arise from their existence. It arises from the absence around them. There are no preserved stages of learning. No visible transition from crude attempt to mastery. Skill appears suddenly, already refined, then disappears. Official explanations isolate each site. Local genius, unique conditions, independent invention. But independence weakens when repetition appears across continents. Techniques recur, ratios repeat. Orientation towards celestial cycles persists. What survives is not civilization, but fragments of its language written in stone, geometry without grammar, engineering without documentation, meaning stripped of context. Later cultures inherit these remnants and reinterpret them. Stone becomes sacred, builders become gods, precision becomes miracle. This is not deception, it is necessity. A society encountering ruins beyond its capability does not assume forgotten ancestors. It assumes intervention. The past, incomprehensible, becomes divine. Stone knowledge may represent a bottleneck in human history. Only certain forms of understanding pass through collapse. Practical geometry survives because it is embedded. Astronomy persists because it is fixed in orientation. Theory vanishes without institutions to sustain it. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. Early civilizations may not have been primitive precursors. They may have been inheritors themselves, rebuilding after collapse with partial access to older systems. Each iteration simplifies what it cannot maintain, leaving behind impressive results without intellectual scaffolding. Monumental achievements remain visible. Processes dissolve. Later societies imitate results imperfectly or abandon them entirely. The illusion of regression emerges not because intelligence declined, but because inheritance narrowed. Stone does not care about attribution. It records only intention and execution, and what it records suggests experience. The unsettling thought is not that ancient builders were extraordinary. It is that their understanding was once ordinary and therefore fragile. What survives now appears miraculous only because it is isolated from the system that made it mundane. As modern society surrounds itself with digital knowledge, ephemeral and infrastructure dependent, it may be repeating the same mistake. What will remain if continuity breaks? Stone does not answer, it waits, and in that waiting lies a warning. What we consider permanent may be nothing more than what has not yet been forgotten. There is a moment in Earth's recent past when certainty falters abruptly. Near the end of the last ice age, as stability seemed to return, temperatures plunged back into near-glacial conditions. This reversal unfolded within decades. Forests retreated, grasslands dried, large animals vanished. Human populations, already fragile, were forced into migration or collapse. The climate behaved as if a switch had been thrown. Yet when attention turns to human societies living through this period, the narrative becomes cautious. According to standard accounts, there was little to lose. Humanity was still simple, knowledge minimal, but this assumption rests on absence. If early societies had begun forming networks along coasts and rivers, precisely the areas most vulnerable, their disappearance would leave little trace. Rising seas would claim settlements, shifting landscapes would erase pathways. What survives from this period is strange, not clear collapse, but interruption. Tool traditions change abruptly. Settlements vanish and reappear elsewhere. Symbolic motifs persist despite material simplification. It feels less like progression and more like reconstruction. And immediately after this instability, evidence of unexpected complexity appears. Monumental construction, ritual centers implying shared cosmology. These developments do not look like invention from simplicity. They look like response to trauma. Catastrophe forced consolidation. Memory became sacred. Ritual replaced explanation. Civilization did not begin here, it reassembled. The reluctance to connect climatic shock to cultural loss may stem from scale. It is easier to imagine environmental stress affecting small groups than entire knowledge systems. Yet history offers countless examples of knowledge loss under far milder conditions. What lingers is not proof but pattern. If the planet can change faster than memory adapts, no civilization is immune. Stability becomes interval, not default. And so the unease returns, deeper now. If humanity rebuilt once from fragments it barely understood, how confident can we be that the knowledge we carry today will survive the next turn? There is a place where the timeline does not merely bend, but turns back on itself. A place where assumptions are forced to step aside, not by speculation, but by presence. Stones arranged with intention long before intention was supposed to exist. Labor coordinated before hierarchy was meant to be possible. Meaning carved into the earth before meaning was thought necessary. The unease this creates is quiet but persistent. If the accepted order places survival before symbolism, utility before ritual, then this place stands as an objection written in stone. It suggests that something fundamental has been misunderstood, not about one site but about sequence itself. What makes this reversal difficult to dismiss is not its scale but its restraint. There are no palaces here, no cities. No obvious markers of centralized power. Instead, there are circles, pillars, carvings of animals rendered with confidence rather than curiosity, images that do not decorate but communicate. The effort required to shape and position these stones implies organization without coercion, planning without agriculture, and purpose without permanence. According to the traditional model, complexity follows stability. People settle, surplus accumulates, hierarchy forms. Only then does symbolic architecture emerge. Here, the order is inverted. Ritual precedes settlement, gathering precedes farming, meaning appears before material necessity demands it. This inversion is unsettling because it implies memory, not memory as recollection, but memory as orientation, an inherited sense of what matters. A community does not invest generations of labor into stone unless it believes something must be preserved. These stones do not feed. They do not shelter efficiently, they do not defend, they witness. If this was not the beginning of civilization but its reconstitution, then ritual takes on a different role. It becomes infrastructure for identity. In a world that has proven capable of erasing landscapes and lifeways, meaning becomes the most durable form of continuity. The carvings deepen the discomfort. Animals appear in motion, entangled, threatening, watchful. They are not symbols of control. They are acknowledgments of presence. Human figures are diminished or absent entirely. The message is not dominion, it is negotiation. Such imagery does not resemble first attempts. It resembles a mature symbolic language, one already shaped by experience. Symbols repeat, motifs recur. This suggests continuity rather than improvisation. The absence of domestic life around these structures is often used to argue primitiveness, but absence can also signal focus. This was not a place to live, it was a place to remember, a place to gather, to recalibrate the relationship between people, land, and sky. If catastrophe preceded this construction, the choice to build ritual space before settlement becomes less mysterious. When continuity has been broken, permanence is not achieved through accumulation, it is achieved through alignment. To rebuild society, one must first rebuild meaning. Food sustains bodies, meaning sustains coordination. Seen this way, the emergence of agriculture that follows is reframed. Farming did not cause civilization. Civilization demanded farming. Sustaining a shared symbolic center requires predictability. Predictability requires control over food. Agriculture becomes a response to ritual, not its prerequisite. This reversal carries uncomfortable implications. It suggests that the roots of civilization are not economic, but psychological. That humanity organizes first around shared belief, then reshapes the environment to support it. If those beliefs were inherited, fragmentary memories of a world that collapsed, then early civilization becomes an act of recovery rather than invention. This also explains the careful burial of these structures. They were not abandoned casually. They were deliberately covered, protected, sealed. This act does not suggest ignorance of value. It suggests reverence or fear. A decision that something had fulfilled its purpose and should not remain exposed. Why seal a memory? Perhaps because memory can become dangerous when its context is lost. Without understanding, symbols harden into dogma. Ritual becomes authority. What once stabilized can later constrain. The existence of such places does not prove earlier civilizations. It does something more subtle. It removes certainty. It demonstrates that complexity can appear where it should not. Once certainty dissolves, questions multiply. If people capable of such organization existed before agriculture, what else did they know? What had they lost that made this gathering necessary? And how many other places like this lie buried, not beneath soil but beneath assumption? This reversal offers no answers. It offers a mirror. It reflects the fragility of the models we rely on to feel secure in our origins. It suggests that civilization is not a straight ascent from need to meaning, but a fragile oscillation between loss and reconstruction. When these stones were finally covered, the act may have been intended as preservation rather than erasure, a message sent forward in time, trusting that someone would eventually uncover it and feel the same unease. As soil settled and generations passed unaware of what lay beneath, the memory did not vanish. It diffused. It reappeared in myths of first teachers. In sacred animals, in the belief that humanity once stood closer to something vast and incomprehensible, If this was a threshold, it was not the threshold of civilization's birth. It was the threshold of forgetting. What followed was not uninterrupted progress, but adaptation layered over absence. The stones remained silent on what came before them, but their presence asks a question that does not fade with time. If meaning came first once, before stability, before permanence, what forced humanity to place it there? And what might force us to do so again? Silence does not always arrive suddenly. Sometimes it is constructed layer by layer until absence feels natural. In the study of history, this kind of silence is the hardest to detect because it is framed as order. Gaps are given names. Missing records are attributed to chance. Burned archives become isolated tragedies rather than patterns. Yet when one steps back far enough, the silences align. Libraries vanish at moments of transition. Archives disappear during regime change. Knowledge becomes centralized, then simplified, then standardized. What survives is not always what was most accurate. It is what was most compatible with the new order. Written history is fragile not because it is weak, but because it is selective. It requires materials, literacy, institutions, and continuity. Remove any one of these, and entire civilizations can become invisible within generations. What remains are echoes, citations without sources, traditions without context, rituals without explanation. This is where erased civilizations intersect with authority, not authority as conspiracy, but as momentum. Once a narrative stabilizes, it attracts preservation. Competing narratives decay. Over centuries, the dominant story reinforces itself simply by surviving. Just systems understood this early. So did empires. Control over calendars, genealogies, and origin stories was not symbolic, it was foundational. To define when history began was to define who belonged within it. This does not require malice, it arises from necessity. A society in transition cannot tolerate too many beginnings. It needs a single origin, a single arc, a single justification for its present structure. Complexity destabilizes, ambiguity threatens cohesion. So historical compression occurs. Thousands of years fold into mythic ages. Prior cultures are reclassified as primitive. Their achievements are attributed to gods or dismissed as exaggeration. The deeper past becomes a blur, not because nothing happened there, but because too much did. What is particularly unsettling is how often these silences align with moments of consolidation. When writing systems are standardized, when calendars reset, when education becomes formalized. Each moment filters memory. What cannot be translated into the new system is lost. This filtering does not erase everything. It leaves anomalies, structures without builders, texts without origins, symbols without clear lineage. These anomalies are tolerated as curiosities, but rarely allowed to reshape the narrative. They are explained individually, never collectively. The result is a curated past, one that feels complete because it is coherent, not because it is comprehensive. The idea that multiple civilizations may have existed before ours threatens this curation. It implies that history is not a chain of improvement, but a field of ruins periodically rebuilt. That modern systems are not culmination, but iteration. This is why such ideas remain marginal. They introduce vulnerability into the story of progress. They suggest that collapse is not an aberration, but a phase, and phases are difficult to reconcile with linear belief. What remains after each erasure is not truth, but memory shaped by survival. Those who endure carry fragments forward. Over generations, fragments harden into myth. Myth becomes tradition. Tradition becomes authority. Authority resists revision. This resistance is rarely explicit. It appears as methodological caution, as peer review skepticism, as funding priorities, as curriculum design, as the quiet assumption that certain questions are no longer worth asking, yet silence has weight. It bends inquiry around itself. It leaves impressions in what is not said, in what is perpetually postponed, in what is framed as speculative rather than investigable. If civilizations were erased repeatedly, their erasure would not look like destruction alone. It would look like simplification, like continuity maintained by narrowing, like stories trimmed until they fit comfortably within the present. The unsettling realization is that we may be living inside such a trimmed story now. One that feels ancient but is young, stable but brittle, complete but fragile, and if this is so, then the question is not who erased the past, it is why erasure or forgetting was easier than preservation, why complexity had to be reduced for society to continue. Perhaps forgetting is not a failure of civilization. Perhaps it is one of its mechanisms, a way to move forward without being crushed by what was lost, a way to rebuild without confronting the full weight of collapse. But mechanisms have consequences. They shape identity. They limit imagination. They make repetition possible by obscuring memory. The silence in the record then is not empty. It is dense with decisions. Decisions about what could be carried forward and what could not. Somewhere within that silence lies the faint outline of civilizations that did not fail completely, but faded just enough for their lessons to become dangerous again. The past does not accuse. It waits. And the more carefully one listens to what is missing, the harder it becomes to believe that forgetting was accidental. When written records fracture and monuments stand without voices, memory finds other vessels. It changes shape. It abandons precision. It learns to travel lightly. In the long aftermath of collapse, what survives is rarely instruction. What survives is impression. Myth is often treated as the opposite of history, yet in times of discontinuity, it may be history's last refuge. When literacy disappears, when institutions fall, when explanation becomes too costly to maintain, memory compresses. It sheds detail the way a body sheds weight in famine. What remains is not accuracy but direction. Across ancient cultures, stories emerge that feel overburdened. Gods who behave like teachers. Ancestors who arrive already knowing laws of building and farming. Heroes who inherit knowledge rather than discover it. These are not narratives of invention. They are narratives of transmission. What is passed on is never the full system. It is the rule without the proof, the practice without the principle. Myth preserves function long after understanding dissolves. This is why myths appear illogical when read literally. They were never meant to be literal. They are mnemonic devices, compressed packets of instruction wrapped in story and symbol. Their purpose is not to explain the past, but to keep something essential alive through periods when explanation itself cannot survive. In this sense, myth is not fantasy. It is emergency memory. The recurrence of certain symbols hints at this function. The flood that resets the world, the serpent that guards knowledge, the mountain that connects sky and earth, the lawgiver who arrives and leaves instructions behind. These motifs appear too consistently to dismiss. What they encode is not an event, but a condition, a world that has broken before, knowledge that was lost once and must not be lost again, a warning that progress is fragile. Language itself bears traces of this compression. Beginnings are framed as restorations, ends described as returns, cycles replace lines. This is not abstraction, it is adaptation. When continuity is unreliable, cyclical models feel safer. They prepare the mind for recurrence. In such cultures, history does not move away from catastrophe. It moves toward it and through it and back again. Survival depends not on preventing collapse, but on remembering how to rebuild afterward. This perspective alters how ancient warnings are read. When texts caution against hubris, they are not moralizing. They are signaling instability. When they speak of divine displeasure, they may be describing forces beyond human control, climate, geology, cosmic events reframed to survive cultural breakdown. Even the idea of gods may reflect this inheritance, not beings to worship, but placeholders for lost explanation. When knowledge becomes incomprehensible, it becomes sacred. Reverence replaces understanding. Authority replaces inquiry. This transition is not failure, it is strategy. Revered knowledge is protected. Questioned knowledge is vulnerable. But the danger emerges later when stability returns, symbols harden, ritual ossifies. What once preserved continuity begins to limit it. Memory survives, but without context. Instructions are followed without understanding consequences. This is how myths can both save and mislead. They allow civilizations to restart, but not to recover fully. Each iteration inherits less than the last, not because memory fades, but because compression intensifies. Over time, this creates the illusion of primitive origins. Later societies appear less sophisticated, not because intelligence declined, but because inheritance narrowed. Seen this way, evidence of multiple civilizations lies not only in ruins, but in repetition, in the way humanity keeps telling the same stories. building the same forms, fearing the same endings. These are not coincidences of imagination, they are echoes of experience. The number of civilizations does not need to be precise. 7 becomes symbolic, not statistical, a container for recurrence, a way to say this has happened before, enough times to be remembered, not enough times to be fully understood. And so the pattern persists, quiet, unresolved, patient, waiting for recognition. Waiting for the moment when humanity looks at its own confidence and feels that familiar unease again, not fear, but the sense that something large once stood here, and that forgetting it may be the most dangerous inheritance of all. When memory is fragile, power learns to arrange it, not always through force, not always through deception, but through structure. By deciding which stories deserve continuity and which can be allowed to dissolve, authority shapes not only the past, but the range of futures that feel possible. Control over history rarely announces itself as control, it presents as order. Every civilization that stabilizes eventually encounters the same problem. Too much memory creates instability. Competing origins undermine legitimacy. Multiple timelines weaken coherence. Ambiguity invites dissent. To govern effectively, the past must be simplified, not erased entirely, but streamlined. This process does not require secret councils or deliberate falsification. It unfolds naturally through institutions. Calendars are standardized, genealogies are formalized, education selects what can be taught efficiently. What resists simplification becomes marginal, then symbolic, then irrelevant. Religious systems play a central role in this compression. By anchoring history to divine narrative, they stabilize meaning across generations. Origins become sacred events rather than open questions. Time acquires purpose. Disorder is reframed as deviation rather than recurrence. Yet sacred time often begins late. Creation stories rarely acknowledge what came before. They draw a boundary between chaos and order and declare that everything prior to that boundary no longer matters. This is not ignorance, it is function. A society cannot define itself if its origins remain uncertain. Empires adopt similar strategies. Conquest is followed by documentation. Local histories are absorbed or overwritten. Administrative records replace oral memory. What cannot be archived is downgraded. The past becomes legible only in forms compatible with governance. In this environment, evidence of earlier civilizations becomes inconvenient. It introduces ambiguity where authority requires clarity. It suggests that power is temporary, that collapse is not punishment but pattern. Such implications do not serve systems built on continuity. The result is not suppression but narrowing. Questions about deep antiquity are not forbidden outright. They are redirected, framed as speculative, deferred indefinitely. The boundary between respectable inquiry and fringe curiosity is drawn not by evidence alone, but by implication. This boundary shifts over time, but it rarely disappears. Even today, research that challenges linear progress struggles for legitimacy. Funding follows consensus. Consensus follows stability. Stability favors familiar stories. What emerges is not a lie, but a bias. A gravitational pull toward narratives that reassure. Narratives that portray the present as culmination rather than interlude. Narratives that treat collapse as exception rather than expectation. This bias shapes interpretation. Anomalies are contextualized until they no longer threaten structure. Sites are dated conservatively. Texts are translated cautiously. Hypotheses implying repetition are softened into metaphor. Meanwhile, the public absorbs a story that feels complete because it is coherent. The absence of contradiction is mistaken for accuracy. The silence between epochs is treated as emptiness rather than eraser. This dynamic creates a feedback loop. The more stable the narrative becomes, the harder it is to revise. Each generation inherits a past already filtered. What was once debated becomes assumed. What was once questioned becomes doctrine, yet doctrine is not memory, it is selection. The idea that multiple civilizations may have existed before ours disrupts this selection, not by introducing new facts, but by reframing interpretation. It asks whether continuity is assumed rather than demonstrated, whether gaps are treated as mysteries or conveniences. This reframing does not accuse institutions of malice. It recognizes that systems evolve to preserve themselves. Memory that threatens stability is metabolized or expelled. This may once have been adaptive. After collapse, societies need cohesion. They need shared origin stories. They need certainty, even if simplified. Complexity can wait, survival cannot, but adaptation becomes limitation when conditions change. A narrative designed to stabilize can later prevent recognition of danger. When history teaches inevitability, warning signs are ignored. When collapse is framed as unthinkable, preparation becomes unnecessary. This is the quiet danger of curated history. It does not deceive, it reassures, and reassurance dulls attention. If earlier civilizations fell in part because they believed themselves secure, repeating their narrative strategies may not be coincidence, it may be inheritance. Memory reshaped to sustain itself, unaware that the same mechanism once preceded collapse. The past managed too carefully loses its ability to instruct. It becomes decoration rather than guidance. And when the next disruption arrives, the absence of remembered precedent leaves societies unprepared. The question then is not whether history has been controlled. It is whether control has outlived its usefulness. Whether the compression that once allowed civilization to continue now prevents it from seeing its own fragility. If memory was narrowed to protect humanity from despair, what happens when that narrowing prevents recognition of risk? If forgetting became a survival strategy once, can it still serve that role? Or has it quietly become the mechanism through which repetition ensures itself again? Patterns rarely announce themselves. They emerge quietly over long stretches of time, mistaken for coincidence until repetition becomes undeniable. When civilizations are viewed not as isolated achievements but as moments within a larger rhythm, a strange familiarity surfaces. The rise feels familiar, the confidence feels rehearsed, even the anxiety feels inherited. Across eras, societies reach moments where expansion accelerates, technology outpaces ethics, and complexity outgrows resilience. These moments are celebrated as peaks, yet in hindsight they appear closer to thresholds. What follows is rarely immediate collapse, more often it is strain, systems stretched thin, knowledge siloed, inequality normalized, warning signs reframed as anomalies. This pattern is visible even within recorded history. Civilizations began fracturing long before their final moments. Infrastructure decayed beneath surface prosperity. Education narrowed. Innovation slowed not from lack of intelligence but from institutional rigidity. What could not be integrated was ignored. When collapse arrived, it rarely resembled apocalypse. It looked like fragmentation. Trade routes failed, cities emptied, administrative language lost coherence. Knowledge requiring coordination vanished first. What survived were local practices, stories, fragments of law, enough to persist, but not enough to rebuild fully. If this dynamic repeats across deeper time, evidence of multiple civilizations would not appear as neat layers. It would appear as echoes. Civilizations rising with familiar ambitions, repeating structural mistakes, inheriting myths without recognizing them as warnings. This reframes the idea of 7 civilizations, not as discrete worlds, but as stages in a cycle of remembering and forgetting. Each iteration begins with humility and memory, grows into confidence, drifts toward amnesia. Collapse follows not from ignorance, but from certainty. The most dangerous moment in a civilization's life may not be its beginning. It may be the moment it believes it has solved collapse. When progress is framed as irreversible, safeguards weaken. Redundancy is dismissed as inefficiency. Long-term thinking becomes optional. What makes this repetition unsettling is that it is internally generated. Civilizations optimize for growth rather than resilience. They privilege speed over durability. Specialization over continuity. In doing so, they make knowledge brittle. Knowledge loss does not begin with catastrophe. It begins with compression. When information is centralized, standardized, abstracted away from lived experience, it becomes efficient but fragile. Disruption does not need to destroy it. It only needs to interrupt access. This fragility may explain why ancient warnings emphasize balance rather than dominance, why myths caution against excess rather than poverty. Why gods punish hubris more often than weakness. These are not moral tales, they are system diagnostics encoded into story. In civilizations that survived collapse, what endured was not the most advanced technology. It was the most adaptable worldview. Those who rebuilt did so using fragments, sometimes misunderstanding them, sometimes revering them, sometimes repurposing them entirely. Over time, origin faded. A tool became symbol. A symbol became myth. A myth became doctrine. Doctrine became identity. Identity resists revision. The danger is not repetition itself, but unconscious repetition. When societies do not recognize patterns, they cannot interrupt them. They mistake familiarity for destiny. They assume that because collapse happened to others, it cannot happen again in the same way. This assumption is reinforced by scale. Modern civilization is global, interconnected, technologically complex. It feels categorically different. Yet complexity increases vulnerability. Interconnection accelerates failure as efficiently as it accelerates growth. If previous civilizations believed their reach protected them, their confidence may have mirrored our own. If they too felt unprecedented, their collapse may have been preceded by the same blindness. The notion that humanity stands within a sequence of civilizations does not diminish achievement. It contextualizes it. It suggests that progress is real, but reversible. That knowledge accumulates, but not indefinitely. That survival depends not on advancement alone, but on memory of limitation. What remains unresolved is whether recognition alters outcome. Awareness does not guarantee intervention. Many past societies recognized decline yet could not stop it. Still, there is a difference between ignorance and awareness. A civilization that understands itself as part of a cycle may preserve differently. It may value redundancy over efficiency. Continuity over expansion, memory over monument. Whether humanity is capable of such foresight remains uncertain. History suggests awareness alone is insufficient, but history also suggests adaptation emerges under pressure, not comfort. If this is the 7th iteration or the 15th, the number matters less than posture. Are we treating knowledge as permanent or provisional? Are we building systems that assume continuity or systems that survive interruption? The past offers no verdict. Only pattern. It shows civilizations rising, believing they have transcended history, and falling, rediscovering they have not. Between those moments lies a narrow window, a moment where choice exists. The question that lingers is not whether the cycle will repeat. It is whether recognition can slow it, whether remembering that others once believed the same things we do might change how we prepare for what history has always been patient enough to deliver. Numbers carry weight long after their origins are forgotten. They persist not because they are precise, but because they feel complete. Among these, one returns with unsettling regularity. 7 days, 7 heavens, 7 gates, 7 ages. The recurrence is rarely explained. It is accepted, as though the number itself remembers something humanity no longer does. In ancient systems of thought, numbers were not abstractions. They were compressions of experience. To count was to pattern the world. When a number survived across cultures, it was not coincidence. It was utility. 7 often appears at moments of transition. Completion followed by rest, fulfillment followed by renewal. This framing does not promise permanence, it anticipates recurrence. What is finished is not final. If civilizations rose and fell repeatedly, encoding recurrence symbolically makes sense. Memory that cannot survive as chronology survives as structure. 7 becomes a way of acknowledging cycles without naming them. Not a count of worlds, but a reminder that beginnings are not singular. Modern interpretation strips numbers of this role. They become superstition, yet persistence suggests resilience. This is not proof, it is resonance. The danger lies in literalism. Symbols are not records, but dismissing them entirely risks losing what they preserve. Symbols survive history. If earlier civilizations recognized collapse as recurrent, they may have chosen to encode that recognition obliquely. Direct warning invites fear. Symbol invites contemplation. A culture that survives collapse does not announce failure, it teaches rhythm. This explains why ancient cosmologies focus less on origin than balance. They ask not where things began, but how they move. Order gives way to disorder and returns again. Excess invites correction. Forgetting follows remembering. Remembering follows forgetting. The present moment occupies an uneasy position. We track cycles in nature while insisting on singularity in culture. We accept recurrence in climate and deny it in civilization. 7 becomes a quiet challenge, not a claim but an invitation. How many times must something repeat before it becomes pattern? How many collapses must be remembered before prevention becomes possible? Symbols do not predict the future. They warn of tendency. They suggest thresholds exist. When societies ignore these warnings, it is often because the warning feels abstract, too distant, too mythic, yet abstraction is precisely what allows memory to survive collapse. A precise account burns with the library, a symbol survives in a song. If civilizations existed before ours, the symbol was not meant to prove it. It was meant to normalize recurrence, to say this is not the first time, and it will not be the last. This realization does not diminish responsibility, it sharpens it. If cycles exist, awareness becomes variable. Preparation matters, adaptation matters, memory matters. The question is whether symbolic memory is sufficient in a world that trusts data more than meaning. When warnings are encoded in metaphor, do we still know how to listen? Or has the distance between symbol and survival grown too wide? 7 remains not as answer, but as trace. A fingerprint left by minds who understood that some truths could not be preserved directly. Who trusted future generations would feel the same unease. Pause and ask why this number of all others refuse to disappear. Perhaps it endures because it does not close the circle. It leaves space, completion without finality, rest without ending. If civilization is rhythm rather than line, then symbols like 7 are its notation, not enough to reconstruct the melody, enough to warn that the next movement will come. And so the thought lingers, unresolved, patient. Whether humanity now stands at the end of another sequence, mistaking completion for permanence, while the symbols left behind wait quietly, ready to mean something again. When memory begins to thin, certainty grows louder, not because it is stronger, but because it feels necessary. Every dominant story produces its margins, not always deliberately, not always cruelly, but inevitably. Where a narrative grows stable enough to define reality, there will be those who stand just outside it. Not because they reject evidence, but because the evidence they follow leads somewhere the narrative cannot comfortably go. Within academia, these figures rarely announce rebellion. They work quietly, they publish cautiously, they phrase their questions with care. Their discomfort is not with data, it is with boundaries, unspoken lines that signal where inquiry becomes inconvenient. These scholars do not usually claim lost civilizations outright. They ask something more subtle. Why do certain questions remain perpetually unresolved? Why do anomalies persist despite decades of investigation? Why do the same sites generate the same unease year after year without prompting structural revision? Why does complexity appear early and disappear quietly? The resistance they encounter is rarely ideological. It is procedural. Peer review demands caution. Funding favors continuity. Careers depend on alignment with existing frameworks. To challenge the timeline is not to be disproven. It is to be delayed, reframed, ignored. This creates a peculiar intellectual climate where doubt survives without momentum. Ideas circulate at the edges, never fully dismissed, never fully embraced. They appear in footnotes, in speculative paragraphs politely separated from conclusions, in conference questions that are acknowledged but not pursued. The cost of asking certain questions is not censorship, it is isolation. The slow realization that pursuing some lines of thought narrows opportunity rather than expanding it. Many adapt, some redirect. A few persist quietly, accepting that their work may outlive their recognition. What unites these efforts is not conspiracy, it is friction. The friction between evidence that suggests repetition and systems designed for linearity, between deep time and institutional patience, between pattern and permission. In some disciplines, this friction is more visible. Archaeology grapples with material that resists narrative. Geology confronts timelines that dwarf human memory. Linguistics encounters sudden complexity without clear lineage. Each field touches the same unease from different angles. When these threads converge, they do not form a conclusion. They form a question too large for any single discipline to answer. Did humanity experience phases of organization now lost to us? And if so, how would such loss present itself without leaving obvious ruins? The difficulty lies in proof. Absence cannot be excavated easily. A civilization erased by water leaves fewer traces than one burned. Knowledge lost through fragmentation leaves patterns, not artifacts. What remains is suggestive rather than definitive. This ambiguity frustrates modern inquiry, which prefers resolution. Yet ambiguity may be the most honest response to deep time. To demand certainty from a record shaped by catastrophe is to misunderstand its nature. Some researchers have proposed reframing the question entirely, not asking whether advanced civilizations existed, but asking what level of organization is required to leave durable traces. What kinds of knowledge survive disruption, which vanish first? What signatures remain after multiple resets? This shift does not prove anything. It changes expectation. It allows for the possibility that what we call prehistory was not empty, but filtered. That what survived did so not because it mattered most, but because it endured best. This reframing rarely reaches public discourse. It lacks spectacle. It offers no finality. It invites uncertainty rather than closure. Yet within uncertainty lies integrity. The scholars who pursue these questions are not driven by nostalgia for lost worlds. They are driven by discomfort with oversimplification. With stories that move too smoothly through terrain marked by rupture. Their work suggests that history is not a fixed archive, but a dynamic system shaped by survival bias. What we know is not what happened, it is what remained possible to know. This perspective does not accuse the past of deception. It recognizes limitation. It acknowledges that the record we inherit is incomplete by design, not through intent, but through entropy. Presence of dissenting inquiry within academia is itself significant. It demonstrates that the narrative is not closed, that beneath consensus lies uncertainty, quietly tolerated, rarely addressed. What remains unresolved is whether this uncertainty will ever reshape the core story. History suggests that paradigms do not shift through accumulation alone. They shift when existing frameworks can no longer absorb anomaly, when the cost of ignoring pattern exceeds the cost of revising belief. Whether humanity is approaching such a threshold remains unclear. The evidence accumulates slowly. The resistance persists. Between them lies a tension that mirrors the larger theme of this journey: continuity versus disruption. If earlier civilizations reached similar moments of tension, they may have faced the same choice: simplify or confront complexity, compress memory or risk instability. Those who chose simplification may have survived in the short term. But their descendants inherited a past already narrowed, already stripped of warning. The quiet scholars at the margins are not asking for belief. They are asking for permission to doubt comfortably, to sit with uncertainty without resolving it prematurely, to allow the past to remain unfinished. Perhaps this too is inheritance, a recognition that some truths cannot be recovered fully, only approached. That humility may be the most durable knowledge of all. And as these questions continue to circulate without conclusion, they form a subtle continuity across time. A reminder that even when civilizations forget, curiosity persists, waiting patiently for the moment when asking again becomes unavoidable. There comes a point where evidence matters less than implication, not because facts lose value, but because their consequences extend beyond verification. To consider that civilizations may have risen and fallen repeatedly is to step into a different relationship with the present, one where identity becomes provisional, where certainty feels thinner. If humanity is not the first to reach complexity, then modernity loses its sense of finality. The present becomes less like a destination and more like a crossing. What we inherit from the past is not a straight path, it is a series of interrupted attempts, each shaped by conditions that no longer exist. This reframing alters how progress is understood. Advancement stops being proof of permanence. Innovation stops being protection. Both become temporary responses to stability, a phase, not a guarantee. What makes this unsettling is not collapse itself. It is the loss of narrative comfort. The belief that history culminates here provides psychological shelter. It reassures us that knowledge once gained is never truly lost, that mistakes are corrected rather than repeated, that humanity is learning its way out of vulnerability. Yet if civilizations have forgotten before, learning is not cumulative in the way we imagine. It is episodic, fragmented. Each iteration inherits only what survived disruption, not what was most valuable. This inheritance creates blind spots, areas where confidence outpaces understanding. Blind spots are invisible from within. A civilization does not recognize its assumptions as assumptions. They feel like reality. Only later, after collapse or from outside, do they appear as choices that might have been made differently. If earlier societies believed themselves secure, their confidence likely felt as justified as ours does now. They had mastered their environment. They had systems of meaning. They had explanations for disaster that reassured rather than unsettled. They too may have believed the worst was behind them. The realization that this confidence may have preceded collapse does not demand fear. It demands attention to fragility, to interdependence, to the difference between resilience and efficiency. Resilience preserves options, efficiency narrows them. Modern civilization excels at efficiency. Knowledge is centralized, systems are optimized, redundancy is minimized. This produces extraordinary capability under stable conditions. It also produces vulnerability when stability fails. If collapse comes not from ignorance but from overconfidence, then the lesson of forgotten civilizations is not technological. It is psychological. It concerns humility, the willingness to treat the present as temporary even while improving it. This humility does not require rejecting modern achievement. It requires contextualizing it, recognizing that tools amplify intention but do not change underlying human patterns. That complexity increases reach, but also dependence. If the past is layered with collapsed civilizations, then survival may depend less on dominance and more on adaptability, on decentralizing knowledge, on encoding memory in multiple forms, on valuing continuity over expansion. This perspective changes what preservation means. It shifts focus from monuments to processes, from artifacts to relationships, from accumulation to transmission. What must survive is not infrastructure, but understanding. Yet understanding is the most fragile inheritance of all. It requires teaching, context, patience. It cannot be stored passively. It must be lived. When systems collapse, lived understanding disappears quickly. This is why myths endure where manuals do not, why symbols travel where explanations fail, why stories outlast institutions. They are inefficient but resilient. If humanity stands within a long sequence of civilizations, then the most important question may not be whether this one will fall. It may be what it will leave behind, what fragments will survive interruption, what warnings will remain legible without context. The temptation is to believe that digital memory solves this problem, that redundancy across networks ensures permanence. Yet digital memory depends on energy, infrastructure, compatibility. It is powerful but brittle. Its durability at civilizational timescales is untested. If memory collapses again, what will endure? Stone, story, symbol, or something yet unimagined? These questions do not lead to despair. They lead to recalibration, to the possibility that success might be measured differently. That progress could include preparation for discontinuity rather than denial of it. The idea of forgotten civilizations, whether ultimately proven or not, serves a function beyond truth. It destabilizes complacency. It reminds us that history is not obligated to preserve our achievements simply because we value them. This destabilization is uncomfortable. It removes the illusion of exceptionalism. It places humanity back inside nature's rhythms rather than above them. Subject to correction as much as growth, what follows from this realization is not retreat, but responsibility. A civilization aware of its provisional status may choose differently. It may invest in resilience over reach, in memory over monument, in adaptability over certainty. Whether such choices are possible remains uncertain. History offers few examples of societies willingly abandoning narratives of permanence, yet awareness itself is new at this scale. The global capacity to compare myths, climates, collapses across continents is unprecedented. This does not guarantee change, but it opens a space where choice exists. Earlier civilizations lacked this perspective. Their collapse may have been inevitable. If we possess it now even partially, the outcome is not predetermined. Patterns repeat. Responses need not. The evidence does not instruct us what to believe. It asks how we live with uncertainty, whether we cling to narratives that comfort or allow questions that unsettle. As this part of the journey draws toward pause, nothing resolves. The past remains incomplete. the present remains fragile, the future remains open. Not because history has finished teaching, but because it has never stopped waiting for someone to listen differently. What matters now is not proving that others were forgotten. It is deciding whether we are willing to remember differently before silence thickens again, before compression smooths the record, before this story too becomes residue. The corridor continues, the doors open briefly, light passes through. What happens next depends not on how bright it shines, but on whether anything is left behind, knowing that darkness eventually always returns. At the edge of every long inquiry, certainty does not collapse, it thins, not because the search has failed, but because it has reached a boundary, the place where explanation can no longer travel intact. If civilizations have risen and fallen before, whether 7 times or many more, then history is not a story with an ending. It is a surface written on, erased, and written again. Each inscription is partial, each erasure incomplete. What remains is not truth in full, but residue. Residue shapes intuition. It appears as unease when timelines feel too clean, as curiosity when ruins feel older than their explanations, as quiet resistance to stories that insist on permanence. These sensations are not evidence, but they are not nothing. They are the mind responding to discontinuity. Throughout this journey, no definitive artifact has emerged. No inscription declares what was lost. No record announces how many times humanity began again. Instead, there has been alignment between myth and geology, between climate and memory, between silence and power. Alignment does not conclude, it accumulates. The temptation now is closure, to declare belief or disbelief, to rest inside an answer. But closure is not what the past offers, it offers tension. The unresolved space between knowing and forgetting. Civilizations before us may have stood in this same space, sensing patterns without fully understanding them, inheriting warnings stripped of context, believing themselves knew even as they repeated ancient gestures. If so, then the most fragile inheritance is not knowledge, it is awareness. Awareness that what feels unprecedented may be familiar, that what feels permanent may be temporary. That forgetting does not announce itself as loss, but as confidence. The end of a civilization rarely feels like an ending. It feels like continuity stretched too thin. Systems still function, just not everywhere at once. Explanations are still offered, just not equally trusted. Memory dissolves unevenly. Some fragments sink, others float. Future generations encounter what surfaces and assume it represents the whole. They build around it, they narrate it, they forget the rest. If this has happened before, then it is not tragedy alone. It is mechanism, a way for humanity to continue without carrying the full weight of previous failure. Forgetting becomes adaptive even as it prepares the ground for repetition. This realization does not demand despair, it invites restraint, a gentler posture toward certainty, a willingness to hold progress without worshiping it, to value preservation not as nostalgia, but as continuity across disruption. What would it mean to live as though this civilization is not the last, but one among many, not in resignation, in responsibility, to treat knowledge as something that must travel, not merely accumulate, to encode memory redundantly in story, in practice, in relationship, to anticipate interruption rather than deny it. Perhaps earlier civilizations did not fail because they lacked intelligence. Perhaps they failed because they underestimated forgetting. Or perhaps they understood it but could not act on that understanding at scale. The difference matters less than the lesson. Awareness does not guarantee survival, but absence of awareness almost guarantees repetition. As this part of the narrative settles, nothing is resolved. The evidence remains suggestive, not decisive. The number 7 remains symbolic, not statistical. The past remains incomplete, not because it was hidden perfectly, but because it was never meant to be fully recoverable. What remains instead is orientation, a recalibration of how history is held, less as a ladder climbed once, more as terrain crossed repeatedly, less as inheritance secured, more as memory at risk. In this framing, the present moment becomes neither triumph nor doom, it becomes interval, a pause between forgetting and remembering, a chance, not a guarantee, to choose differently. Outside this story, the world continues its quiet processes. Ice forms and melts, seas rise and fall, languages shift. Symbols outlast explanations. Somewhere far from attention, future layers are already forming. One day others may stand where we stood, surrounded by fragments we believed essential, interpreting them through lenses shaped by their own uncertainties. They may wonder what we knew, what we failed to pass on. Whether they call us the seventh civilization or never number us at all will matter less than whether something of value survives the distance between now and then. And so this journey does not end with an answer. It ends with an image. History as a long, dim corridor lined with doors that open briefly before closing again. Some lead to memory, others to silence. Each generation walks only a short distance, carrying a light it believes is new, unaware of how many times the same glow has passed this way before. What happens next depends not on how brightly the light shines, but on whether anyone thinks to leave something behind, knowing that darkness eventually always returns. There is a subtle shift that occurs when a civilization begins to mistake its tools for permanence. It does not announce itself. It does not feel like arrogance. It feels like maturity. Systems become efficient. Processes become streamlined. Knowledge becomes accessible, searchable, stored. The world feels legible. And this legibility creates an illusion that what can be accessed can always be recovered, that what is recorded can never truly vanish, that memory has finally been secured against loss. But memory has never failed because it lacked storage. It has failed because it lost context. A tool survives longer than the understanding that shaped it. A structure endures longer than the reason it was built. A record outlasts the worldview required to interpret it. When continuity breaks, meaning does not disappear all at once, it fractures. Fragments remain, but the relationships between them dissolve. This is how advanced systems can collapse into superstition, how precise knowledge becomes ritual, how instruction becomes law, not because people become less intelligent, but because intelligence without context cannot reconstruct intent. Modern civilization places immense faith in information. We collect it, duplicate it, distribute it. We assume that redundancy equals resilience, yet the most fragile aspect of knowledge is not data, it is interpretation. A civilization can lose its ability to understand itself long before it loses its archives. Consider how quickly meaning shifts even within stable societies. Languages evolve, words change connotation, symbols invert, documents written only centuries ago already require explanation. Now extend that distance across millennia, across collapse, migration, reorganization. What survives may still be readable, but no longer comprehensible. This is why past civilizations appear simultaneously brilliant and naive. Their achievements astonish us. Their explanations confuse us. We marvel at precision while dismissing belief. Yet belief may have been the vessel that allowed precision to survive at all. When continuity is threatened, knowledge often hides inside reverence. Sacredness is not ignorance, it is protection. What is sacred is preserved. What is ordinary is discarded, but sacredness comes at a cost. It freezes inquiry. What begins as preservation eventually becomes prohibition. The same mechanism that saves knowledge through collapse can suffocate it during stability. This cycle, preservation through reverence, stagnation through dogma, appears again and again. It is not the failure of civilization, it is one of its trade-offs. When societies lose the capacity to hold uncertainty, they replace inquiry with certainty. When they lose flexibility, they replace understanding with authority. This is not decay, it is adaptation taken too far. If earlier civilizations experienced similar tensions, they may have reached points where complexity exceeded resilience, not technologically, but cognitively. Too many systems depended on uninterrupted continuity. Too much knowledge required too much coordination. When disruption arrived, simplification became survival. What could not be simplified was lost. The present moment carries this same tension. We possess extraordinary tools, but increasingly fragile systems of meaning. We can store information globally, but struggle to transmit understanding locally. Knowledge becomes abstracted from lived experience. Expertise becomes siloed. Systems become so complex that no individual can hold them fully. This produces power, but also dependency. When understanding is centralized, disruption anywhere becomes disruption everywhere. A society that cannot degrade gracefully is one that collapses abruptly. This is not prophecy, it is pattern. Past civilizations did not disappear because they were foolish. They disappeared because their systems could not survive interruption, and interruption is not anomaly, it is inevitability. Earth does not require catastrophe to disrupt continuity. Slow change is sufficient. Climate shifts. Resource redistribution, migration pressures. These changes rarely destroy civilizations outright, they strain them, they expose brittleness, and brittleness reveals itself not in failure but in rigidity. A rigid system cannot adapt without breaking. A flexible one can lose pieces and still function. This distinction matters more than advancement. Resilience is not achieved by strength. It is achieved by redundancy, diversity, and humility. Yet humility is difficult to institutionalize. It resists hierarchy. It undermines narratives of culmination. A civilization that believes itself temporary behaves differently than one that believes itself final. It preserves differently, it educates differently, it plans differently. Most civilizations do not believe themselves temporary. They believe they are the answer. This belief is understandable. It feels earned. It feels justified by success. But success is not proof against repetition. If anything, it invites it. The higher the peak, the farther the fall. This does not mean collapse is punishment. It means complexity carries cost. If the past teaches anything consistently, it is that continuity is rare. What persists across time is not structure but pattern. The same pressures reappear. The same solutions are attempted. The same blind spots recur. Humanity does not repeat because it fails to remember facts. It repeats because it fails to remember limits. Limits are uncomfortable. They contradict ambition, they demand restraint, they suggest that not everything gained can be kept. Earlier civilizations may have encoded these limits symbolically, not because they lacked data, but because data could not survive collapse. Symbols could. A story warning against excess travels farther than a manual explaining why. A myth describing flood outlasts a chart recording sea levels. This does not make myth superior, it makes myth durable. Modern culture often mistakes durability for falsehood. We value precision over persistence, but precision without persistence is fragile. If the past was shaped by cycles of collapse and recovery, then what survived was not the most accurate knowledge, it was the most compressible. This explains why ancient wisdom often feels abstract, why it emphasizes balance rather than mechanism, why it cautions behavior rather than explains process. These teachings were not designed for mastery. They were designed for survival. The danger now is that we have mistaken mastery for immunity. We assume that understanding mechanisms protects us from their consequences, but understanding does not equal control, and control does not equal permanence. The planet does not negotiate, it responds. If earlier civilizations collapsed under pressures they did not fully understand, modern civilization may face pressures it understands, but cannot fully mitigate. Awareness does not eliminate vulnerability. It only changes how vulnerability is approached. This is where the question of memory becomes urgent, not memory of events, but memory of fragility. Does modern society remember how easily systems can fail, or has success insulated it from that awareness? The more seamless a system becomes, the harder it is to imagine it stopping. The more invisible its dependencies, the more shocking their loss. Earlier civilizations may have believed their rituals stabilized the world. We believe our technologies do. Both beliefs carry risk. The world does not require our belief to continue. It only requires conditions. When conditions change, systems adapt or they do not. The difference lies in preparation. Preparation is not prediction. It is posture, a willingness to expect disruption, to value continuity over optimization. To leave behind not just monuments, but instructions for rebuilding. Yet even instructions fail without context. This returns us to the core problem. What survives collapse is not what is written, it is what is embodied. Skills practiced regularly endure longer than those documented once. Relationships persist longer than institutions. Ways of thinking survive longer than specific answers. If modern civilization wishes to leave something durable behind, it may need to think less about preservation of artifacts and more about preservation of adaptability. This is not romanticism, it is historical realism. The civilizations that endured longest were not those with the greatest structures. They were those that could fracture without dissolving. that could forget without losing orientation, that could rebuild without believing themselves original. The tragedy of forgetting is not that the past is lost, it is that the lessons embedded in its loss become inaccessible. If civilizations before us encoded warnings in myth, symbol, and ritual, it was not because they lacked intelligence. It was because they anticipated discontinuity, they assumed interruption, they planned for a future that might not understand them. This assumption is absent from most modern planning. We plan for continuity, we optimize for stability. We design systems that work beautifully until they do not. The question is not whether disruption will come, it always does. The question is whether memory will survive it in a usable form, not as nostalgia, not as fragments mistaken for miracles, but as guidance, as orientation, as a sense of what matters when systems fall silent. If humanity has restarted before, then survival did not come from remembering everything. It came from remembering enough to rebuild meaning. Enough to avoid immediate repetition, enough to continue. This reframes the idea of lost civilizations one final time. They were not failures erased, they were attempts concluded. Each left something behind, not always visible, not always understood. The danger now is not that we will forget them. It is that we will believe we no longer need to remember in the same way, that we have outgrown cycles, that we have transcended pattern. History suggests otherwise, not cruelly, patiently. And patience is history's most consistent trait. As this part of the journey continues, the question remains open. Not whether civilizations existed before ours, but whether we are listening to what their absence is still trying to say. Not with certainty, but with care, not with fear, but with attention. Because the most dangerous moment in any civilization's life is not collapse. It is the moment it stops imagining that collapse is possible. And that moment rarely feels dramatic. It feels like confidence, it feels like arrival, it feels like the end of history, and that feeling more than any flood, fire, or ice is what history has learned to wait for. There is a moment just before a story ends when the listener realizes the story was never really about the past. It was about posture, about how one stands inside uncertainty, about how one listens when answers refuse to arrive, about whether discomfort is treated as threat or as signal. If civilizations have risen and fallen before, then the most important inheritance they left behind was not stone, not myth, not technology. It was a question that survives because it cannot be answered cleanly. What does it mean to live knowing that continuity is fragile? Most societies do not collapse because they ignore danger. They collapse because danger becomes familiar. Warning signs blend into background noise. Adaptation becomes postponement. Confidence hardens into assumption. By the time collapse is visible, it is no longer preventable, only survivable. This is why collapse rarely feels sudden to those living through it. It feels gradual, fragmented, like a series of inconveniences rather than a turning point. The past does not vanish all at once, it thins. Memory slips not through violence, but through neglect, through compression, through the quiet decision to simplify what feels too heavy to carry forward. If humanity has restarted before, it likely did not experience those moments as endings. They experienced them as continuity under stress. They believed they were adapting, not forgetting. And perhaps they were right. Forgetting may have been the price of survival. To remember everything after catastrophe would be unbearable. To carry the full weight of failure would paralyze reconstruction. So memory learned to travel lighter. It became symbol. It became ritual. It became story. It shed detail to preserve direction. This is not tragedy, it is strategy, but strategy carries consequence. Each compression loses resolution, each restart inherits less clarity than the last. Over time, what was once instruction becomes allegory. What was once warning becomes myth. What was once experience becomes belief. And belief without context becomes certainty. Certainty is comfortable, it creates identity, it stabilizes meaning. It allows societies to build without looking over their shoulder, but certainty is also brittle. It resists revision. It dismisses anomaly. It mistakes coherence for completeness. If there is one consistent lesson embedded in the silence of the past, it is this: civilizations do not fall because they lack knowledge. They fall because they overestimate how securely that knowledge is held. They assume memory is permanent. They assume progress accumulates. They assume that what has been achieved cannot be undone. These assumptions feel reasonable until continuity breaks, and continuity always breaks, not necessarily through catastrophe, sometimes through drift, through gradual misalignment between systems and reality, between complexity and resilience, between speed and comprehension. When systems grow faster than understanding, collapse does not arrive as destruction, it arrives as confusion. Decisions still get made, infrastructure still functions, but coherence fades. What once worked stops working together. The past offers countless examples of this moment, not as warning signs in hindsight, but as familiar patterns. Centralization followed by rigidity, efficiency followed by fragility, expansion followed by strain. None of these guarantee collapse, but together they narrow options. They reduce adaptability. They make recovery harder. If earlier civilizations encoded their awareness of this fragility symbolically, it was not because they lacked intelligence. It was because intelligence alone could not survive interruption. Symbol could, story could, pattern could. What we call myth may be the last layer of memory that survives when everything else fails. This reframes how the past should be read, not as a failed attempt at science, not as superstition, but as emergency transmission. Messages sent forward without knowing who would receive them or how much context would remain. The flood stories do not demand belief, they demand humility. The cycles do not demand surrender, they demand attention. The repeated warnings against excess are not moral judgments, they are system feedback. They are saying this has broken before. If humanity now stands at another moment of extraordinary capability, then the question is not whether we are more advanced than those who came before. We almost certainly are. The question is whether we are more resilient. Resilience is not measured by power. It is measured by how much can be lost without losing orientation. Can a society fracture and still remember how to rebuild? Can it decentralize knowledge before it is forced to? Can it value redundancy without calling it inefficiency? These questions are uncomfortable because they resist spectacle. They do not flatter. They do not promise triumph. They ask for restraint in a culture that rewards acceleration. If this civilization is not the first and will not be the last, then the measure of its success may not be what it builds, but what it leaves usable behind. Not monuments that inspire awe, but frameworks that survive misunderstanding. Not artifacts that demand explanation, but patterns that guide behavior when explanation is gone. This requires a shift in how legacy is imagined. Legacy is not permanence, it is transfer. It is the ability of something meaningful to survive translation across time, collapse, and loss of context. Most things do not survive that journey, only the most essential do. This may explain why ancient memory feels abstract, why it speaks in cycles rather than dates, why it warns rather than explains, why it feels incomplete. It is incomplete because completeness was not survivable. If this realization feels unsettling, that is appropriate. It means the story is doing its work. It is loosening the grip of certainty without replacing it with fear. It is creating space to imagine a civilization that does not see itself as final, space to value continuity over dominance, space to listen to silence without rushing to fill it. The past does not ask to be believed, it asks to be respected, respected as fragmentary, respected as biased by survival, respected as shaped by forces larger than intention. What remains after this long journey is not an answer. It is a posture, a way of holding history that is lighter, more cautious, more aware of what cannot be recovered. If humanity has forgotten before, then remembering differently now may be the only meaningful response. Not remembering everything, but remembering limits, remembering fragility, remembering that certainty is not safety. This does not mean retreat, it means balance. It means building with the assumption that interruption will come and designing systems that can bend without breaking. It means treating progress as provisional rather than guaranteed. It means teaching not just how things work, but how they fail. The most dangerous inheritance is not ignorance, it is confidence without context. As this story reaches its end, the corridor remains, the doors still open briefly, the light still passes through. What changes is awareness, an understanding that the glow we carry is not new. It has passed this way before, and one day it will pass again. What matters is not how brightly it shines, but whether anything is left behind that can help someone else recognize the path when the corridor grows dark once more. If this story has made you pause, even slightly, then it has done what it was meant to do. If you want to continue this journey, take a moment to subscribe, not for certainty, but for patience. This is not a story meant to be rushed. It unfolds slowly, layer by layer, the way memory always has. If you are still here, watching quietly, I invite you to leave a comment. Tell us where you are watching from. Tell us what time it is where you are. Small points of light scattered across the world, noticing the same silence together. And if you choose to stay, thank you. History is patient. So are those who learn to listen.